Well, I think precisely what makes China a difficult policy problem is that it's both. But I think policymakers have to be particularly mindful of the fact that in important respects, China is a developing country. What do I mean by that? A developed country has institutions, political institutions, among the most important of which are succession institutions. China really has no well-accepted, describable, constitutionally grounded succession process. So I would say the political system at its most fundamental level is not fully developed. I think a political system also has to be appropriate to the society that it's governing. And China's become, in the last 20, 30 years, a much more pluralistic society, and yet its political institutions really aren't very well equipped to deal with social pluralism. Certainly we think of developed countries as having stable rules, rule of law, adjudication of conflicting viewpoints, and so forth. China really has a very rudimentary legal system, to put it delicately. If you look at per capita income indicators, of course, China has a middle class that by some counts would be 350 million, and that could be a big margin of discussion. That's a population the size of the United States. But on the other hand, it still has 1 billion people that are at various levels of poverty. And what makes governing China difficult is that you've got to meet the rising aspirations of the middle class. At the same time, you're trying to meet the economic and social demands of people that are really at the beginning of the modernization process. So when we think about China's power, I think we have to keep in mind these fundamental weaknesses. On the other hand, China has deep pockets of modernity and capability, economic, military, technological. I mean, this is a country that's now put over 10 people in space and brought them back. It has the capability to interfere with global communication systems technologically. And therefore, our security apparatus, for example, has to treat this as a serious capability that could impair our ability to operate air, sea, space around the world. So that in that regard, you would say China's indeed powerful, becoming more powerful, and a consideration for the most modern military in the world. I think one way to think about it is the way the Chinese sometimes speak about it. So this isn't a sort of condescending outsider's description, but I've heard Chinese refer to themselves as an adolescent. In other words, if you think development is more sort of a young, very young person's state of sort of infancy, China certainly in 1949 was an infant developing state. China's now, I would say, and many Chinese would say, an adolescent state. It's got capabilities, but its balance sometimes isn't very good. And it doesn't have all the stabilizing institutions to keep economic stability, and we're seeing that, for instance, now with the stock market. It has a stock market, but it doesn't have the regulatory experience and institutions to manage it, and we see huge volatility. So I think China is a country of mass, and that gives it power. I mean, when you're 20% of the world's people and you occupy the strategic real estate that China does, you're going to be very important. And so we see a category of problems like climate change, where there isn't going to be a solution to that problem unless China is part of that solution. And we could say that about India. If we're talking about global environmental issues of global health, if China doesn't deal with some of the viruses coming out of South China. So China, by its very size, strategic location, and mass, is really an indispensable partner. And that means it has to be incorporated into decision-making on the global level, where in more conventional terms, whether it's per capita GDP or military power, it might not be entitled to be at those tables, but its mere size injects it there. So I would say China's an adolescent power, so to speak. It has deep pockets of capability that are taken seriously by other economies and militaries. But at a very fundamental level, China's leaders are insecure precisely because of the aspects of its political and economic system that are not even nearly fully developed. Well, I think you can look, probably the place to start is the World Bank's Handbook of Development Indicators. And historically, of course, there have been per capita gross national product or gross development product, and sometimes they're done on an exchange rate basis and sometimes purchasing power parity, and those can produce rather different results. But all of those would indicate that China is still a lower middle power, and in some areas, China's a desperately poor country if you break it down regionally. But certainly economic indicators are well established in the metrics. Now, that doesn't mean China provides great data or reliable data, and so there's always the question of, yes, you've got a figure, but what is the underlying reality? So you've got both the question, what's the indicator, and how much reliability do you attach to it? Another set of indicators that are very well accepted and I think very important have to do with health indicators. And China, in terms of its longevity, life expectancy, is a highly developed country, almost in the category of the United States. And then there are sub-health indicators like maternal mortality. That is, out of every 100,000 live births, how many mothers die in the process. There's infant mortality, usually the first 5 years of life. And China, in both of those indicators, has dramatically gone up in the last 2 or 3 decades and has a more like a developed country profile. And I think this is, when you talk about human rights and so forth in China, at least these economic and social and health indicators are part of what I would call as a comprehensive definition of human rights, and probably the most fundamental. So in any case, China has a rather impressive profile there, and China would say that it's done a very good job in human rights on these kinds of social and economic indicators, as opposed to the treatment of sort of First 10 Amendment kinds of rights that we take and the international community takes to be important. So I think the health indicators and economic indicators are rather well established, relatively well, and I think what we know about China along these dimensions is pretty accurate. The absolute numbers may not be exact, but I think the trend line that the numbers paint over the years is fairly accurate. So social and economic indicators, I would say China's moving rapidly in the first case, and certainly the social and medical kinds, health indicators, I think, are actually almost developed country characteristics. Well, I think, when you're talking about 20% of the world's people, any summary kind of statement should elicit lots of buts, howevers, and wherevers. And I think trying to describe China in a single summary indicator is probably a pretty futile task. But I think you have to make a first stab at it, and I think if you talk about the economic indicators and the health indicators, that gets one picture. If you talk about all the problems China has, you could start looking at its budget. You could start looking at its capacity to maintain law and order and how much money out of its national budget it has to spend and so forth. So I think you have to try to describe China from a number of perspectives. And it's really all of those data points then begins to paint a very differentiated picture. But if you try to just describe China along one dimension, and realize that China is a continental-sized country approximately a little bigger than the United States. Most Americans wouldn't try to describe the United States in one or two indicators we'd want. And I think China, in some sense, is a more complex analytic task than describing the U.S. Well, I think particularly if you look around China's periphery, and this relates to is China a developing or developed country, China has not, I would say, not fully integrated a very vast part of its periphery. Probably about 1/3 of the territorial space of China is occupied by admittedly small percentage of the population, but it covers a lot of territory. Tibet, Xinjiang would be the most notable. Big, huge areas with relatively small populations. And these areas are still predominantly by non-Han, what Chinese would refer to as minority people. And these groups stretch across national boundaries into neighboring countries. And these peoples, generally speaking, have access to poor infrastructure. They have access to poor health care systems and so forth. So if you begin to think about the complexity and the lack of control and development along China's periphery, I think it's entirely appropriate for international development organizations to see China in a disaggregated way and see it as a complex multi-ethnic state, and recognize at the same time you have the Shanghais and the Tianjins and the Guangdongs and that are going gangbusters economically. You've got areas that are really still in the 19th or earlier centuries.